about what needed to be done with the other 29 countries. Also, 10 years ago, virtually all of the members of the OECD allowed tax deductions for bribe payments. I know it's hard to believe, but a lot has happened in the last 10 years. So, high-level discussions took place, and the 30 countries decided that they would negotiate 2 politically binding instruments, which were not legally binding. One was a 1990 recommendation of the OECD Council, and another one was a 1996 recommendation of Council. The first one addressed the detection and the prevention of the bribery foreign public officials. The second one addressed the tax deductibility of bribes to foreign public officials. But soon after these 2 instruments were negotiated, the countries realized that they had to go further. They needed a binding instrument. And that is when they negotiated the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which was adopted in 1997 and came into force in February 1999. So when I say 10 years ago, it's a little bit over 10 years. This is the 10th year anniversary of the coming into force of the convention. This is a criminal law convention exclusively. The purpose of this convention is to establish standards that the states' parties must follow in establishing in their own domestic laws an offense of bribing a foreign public official in international business transactions. This must be a criminal offense. Corporations must also be liable for the offense, and the offense must be sanctioned by effective, proportionate, and dissuasive penalties. In addition, the convention tells the countries that are parties to it that they must establish not only territorial jurisdiction over the offense, but jurisdiction over the offense when it takes place abroad. And this is very, very important because in a lot of Anglo-Saxon legal systems, it is not automatic that there is jurisdiction over offenses when they take place abroad in another country, Canada being one of those countries. You can understand, though, that when you're talking about the bribery of foreign public officials in international business transactions, the offense is normally going to take place abroad. So if a country does not have the ability to prosecute that case when it takes place abroad, it really can't do very much. And I'm very, very sad to inform you that Canada is the only country of the 38 parties to the convention that does not have jurisdiction when the offense takes place abroad. But I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So, 10 years after entry into force of the convention, we have 38 parties now. We have the 30 OECD member countries and 8 other countries, which are Argentina, Brazil, Bulgaria, Chile, Estonia, Israel, Slovenia, and South Africa. Israel and South Africa are the most recent members. Together, these 38 countries, the states parties to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, comprise the OECD Working Group on Bribery in International Business Transactions. Now, I mentioned the reasons why the OECD was chosen as the venue for establishing this convention. I talked about unfair competition, the leveling the playing field. I'm just going to go into a little bit more depth about why the OECD decided to fight this form, this very, very specific form of corruption. It's not just a question of fair competition. It's also and not just a question of fair competition between the states parties to the convention, but there's another factor, and that is the companies in the countries where the foreign public officials are located. In many developing countries, as you probably know, the private sector is made up of small and medium enterprises, homegrown enterprises that are trying to get off the ground. How are they supposed to do that if they have to compete with foreign companies that are able and willing to afford the cost of bribes? So, in other words, this is a very, very important form of corruption to fight, not just level the playing field between the countries from the rich countries, but also to give those companies in the developing world an opportunity to be able to compete. And private sector development obviously is one of the most important ingredients for sustainable economic development in those countries. Another important reason why the OECD decided to fight this form of corruption is because of the impact of the bribery for public officials and the harm that it causes in those countries receiving the bribes. Obviously, it has a huge impact on good governance and the integrity in government institutions whose officials are bribed. The result of this kind of corruption is theft of government assets and the loss of trust in the government institutions by the local population, as well as foreign investors. So in the long run, in the medium run, the economies in these developing countries are not seen as a favorable place to invest. Maybe in the short run they are, but in the long run they're not. And so in the long run, companies take out their investments. And of course, this is increasing poverty and instability and is harmful to sustainable economic development in those countries. This whole issue of what is the impact on sustainable economic development and the harm that is caused to these countries where their foreign public officials are bribed is a huge issue. And unfortunately, there has not been a lot of research done on it to date. We assume that harm is caused in certain ways. We're pretty sure that harm is caused in certain ways, but we need concrete evidence to take this campaign even further. And so the OECD will be embarking on an impact study in 2010 to provide more concrete evidence, and therefore this will be an extremely important awareness-raising tool. Now, how does the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention work? I mentioned that it is a criminal law convention, that the parties to the convention are required to establish a criminal offense according to the standards in the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. But what does this matter? How do you make sure that the states parties to the convention are actually doing what they signed up to do? This is where the OECD convention is very, very different from other conventions in the world. It has developed a very famous monitoring mechanism, which even Transparency International calls the golden standard in monitoring. It is a peer review system, and it results in hard-hitting recommendations to countries in order to implement the convention according to its standards. This peer review process works like this. When a country is being assessed for compliance with the convention, 2 other countries that are states parties to the convention are chosen as lead examiners. These lead examiners are chosen according to a very specific formula, but usually one country will be from the same region and one country will have a similar legal system. I'll give you an example of the Canadian experience. Canada has been evaluated 2 times by the same 2 countries, the United States and Switzerland.